March 18, 1584. A chess piece slips from trembling fingers and strikes cold marble. The sound cuts through the Kremlin chamber like a funeral bell. Within moments, the most feared ruler in Europe is gasping, clawing at his throat, his eyes bulging with raw terror. But here's what the official histories have desperately tried to bury for over 4 centuries. The two men standing closest to Ivan the Terrible as he took his final breath had just discovered something that guaranteed their execution by dawn if he survived the night. Every textbook will tell you Ivan died of natural causes while playing chess. Just an aging tyrant's body finally surrendering to time. But an English diplomat who stood in that very room wrote a single word in his private account that shatters the entire narrative. A word that's been conveniently overlooked by generations of historians. And when Soviet scientists opened his tomb in 1963, what they discovered sealed inside his bones revealed a conspiracy so elaborate it would make the darkest political thriller seem tame by comparison. To understand why someone would risk everything to end Ivan's life, you need to see what this man had become in those final months. By early 1584, Ivan wasn't simply dying, he was transforming into something so nightmarish, so unstable, that even those who deserved him for decades began to believe his death might be the only merciful option left. Picture power itself rotting from within. At 53 years old, Ivan should have commanded respect, wielded authority with the confidence of decades. Instead, witnesses described a figure that barely resembled anything human. Jerome Horsey, an English diplomat who'd spent nearly 20 years observing the Russian court, left behind accounts that read like entries from a physician's journal of horrors. Ivan's body had swollen grotesquely, but the transformation wasn't uniform. Parts of him had expanded so severely he could no longer walk unassisted, forced to be carried through his own palace on a litter like cargo. His skin peeled away in sheets, and his spine had begun fusing together vertebra by vertebra, twisting his frame into a permanent question mark whenever he attempted to stand. When those Soviet scientists finally examined what remained of Ivan, they found mercury concentrations in his bones nearly 10 times the amount that should kill an ordinary person. Not traces, not residue. His very skeleton was saturated with it, along with disturbing quantities of arsenic. Now, mercury was commonly used to treat syphilis in the 16th century, a disease Ivan certainly suffered from based on the scarring visible in his remains. But these levels point toward something far more sinister. Consider what mercury poisoning actually does to the human mind. It doesn't simply end your life, it rewrites your consciousness on the way down. Paranoia becomes your permanent reality. Every shadow conceals an assassin. Every whispered conversation is treason. Your emotional swings grow so violent that witnesses reported Ivan would literally foam at the mouth during his episodes, shaking uncontrollably, tearing chunks of his own hair out by the roots. One diplomat with no reason to embellish described how the smallest irritation, a servant holding the wrong cup, a door closing with too much force, would send the Tsar into fits where he'd attack anyone within reach, biting them like a rabid animal gone mad with disease. But the physical deterioration was merely the visible symptom. The true horror of Ivan's final days was psychological, and it all traced back to a single moment that shattered whatever remained of his poisoned mind. November 16, 1581, less than 3 years before his death. Ivan entered a room and saw his pregnant daughter-in-law wearing what he deemed inappropriate clothing. Perhaps her dress revealed too much. Perhaps her head covering wasn't proper. The exact detail has been lost to time, but what happened next altered the course of Russian history forever. Ivan attacked her with such savage brutality that she miscarried on the spot. When his son, also named Ivan, his heir and the future of everything he'd built, rushed in to protect his wife, the confrontation erupted into something irreversible. According to witnesses interviewed immediately after, the younger Ivan shouted words that sealed his fate. "You imprisoned my first wife in a convent without cause. You did the same to my second. And now you strike the third, killing the son she carries in her womb." The elder Ivan always carried an iron-tipped staff, his personal instrument for beating courtiers who displeased him. In that instant of rage, he swung it at his son's temple. The pointed iron connected with a wet crack that could be heard through closed doors. What followed was 5 days of agony that broke something fundamental in Ivan's already fracturing mind. The younger Ivan didn't die immediately. He lingered, bleeding internally, sometimes conscious enough to forgive his father, sometimes screaming in pain that echoed through the palace halls. The elder Ivan never left his bedside, and what witnesses recorded reveals everything about his mental collapse. He didn't simply grieve. He performed grief like theater. He beat his own head against the floor so hard, and so repeatedly that he developed a permanent callus on his forehead. He'd prostrate himself before religious icons for hours, creating a bizarre spectacle where Russia's most feared ruler would publicly debase himself, then, moments later, order someone's execution for making eye contact. This wasn't normal grief. This was the complete psychological shattering of a man whose entire worldview had just imploded. Ivan had spent his reign paranoid about succession, about traitors trying to destroy his dynasty. He'd executed thousands on mere suspicion, and then, in one uncontrolled moment, he became the very thing he feared most, the destroyer of his own bloodline. From that moment until his death, Ivan lived in two realities simultaneously. In one, he remained the terrible Tsar, making political calculations, negotiating marriages, threatening enemies. In the other, he was haunted by an endless procession of his victims, convinced that every physical torment was divine punishment, every pain a message from the son he'd murdered. The ghosts had grown crowded by 1584, and Ivan's body count wasn't just high. It was creatively, sadistically astronomical. During what he called the Upraknina from 1565 to 1572, Ivan had essentially declared war on his own population. His personal army of black-clad killers rode horses decorated with severed dog heads and brooms, symbols of sniffing out and sweeping away the Tsar's enemies. Except enemies meant anyone Ivan pointed at on any given day. The torture methods weren't simply cruel. They were performance art designed to break the human spirit. People were boiled alive in massive cauldrons while their families watched helplessly. Others were impaled on stakes engineered to keep them conscious for days, their own weight slowly driving wood through their bodies. Some were sewn into bearskins and thrown to hunting dogs. Others had ribs extracted one by one while still aware. But nothing compared to Novgorod. The death toll varies wildly depending on sources, anywhere from 2,000 to 60,000 souls. An entire city had been essentially erased from existence. By 1584, every one of these deaths weighed on Ivan's diseased consciousness. He'd started keeping lists, called synodics, containing names of people he'd ordered killed. Over 3,000 names he could actually remember. He sent these lists to monasteries with gold, begging monks to pray for his victims' souls. Consider that psychology. He was lucid enough to recall specific names and faces, but not stable enough to stop adding new ones. Meanwhile, his physical state broadcasted decay to everyone around him. The mercury and syphilis had created symptoms that transformed the Tsar into something from medieval nightmare. His joints had swollen until his fingers resembled sausages. His face would randomly erupt in boils that burst during state meetings, leaking onto his elaborate robes. The spinal fusion forced him to shuffle sideways, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. But the behavioral changes terrified his court most. Ivan had always been unpredictable, but now his mood followed no logic whatsoever. He'd discuss policy calmly, then suddenly scream about invisible enemies in the walls. He'd order elaborate feasts, then halfway through declare the food poisoned and have the cooks killed. He once spent 3 hours explaining why emeralds could detect lies, then forgot the entire conversation minutes later. Even as his body disintegrated, Ivan obsessed over marrying Lady Mary Hastings, an English noblewoman. But this marriage obsession mattered because Boris Godunov, Ivan's brother-in-law and future Tsar, saw an English marriage as a direct threat. Bogdan Belsky, Ivan's closest confidant, shared similar concerns. Both men knew Ivan's paranoia could turn on them instantly, and an English queen would accelerate that moment. Then, 3 days before Ivan's death, according to disputed but persistent accounts, something happened that made both men realize they were living on borrowed time. Whether a specific incident occurred or not, by March 18th, the atmosphere in the Kremlin had become explosive. Ivan had summoned astrologers to predict his future, and they'd made a fatal mistake. They told him truth. He would die on March 18th, they said. Ivan promised to burn them alive on March 19th if they were wrong. March 18th arrived with Ivan feeling surprisingly improved. He took a bath that seemed to ease his swollen joints. He emerged appearing more lucid than he'd been in weeks, even joking with courtiers. That afternoon, Ivan gave Jerome Horsey a rambling lecture on gemstones. He picked up turquoise stones, watching them change color. You see, they show their virtue by the change of their pure color into pale, he told Horsey. This declares my death. Then suddenly, mid-sentence he collapsed. I faint. Carry me away, he gasped. Hours later, as sunset approached, Ivan called for a chessboard. Except for that single word Jerome Horsey wrote in his private account. Strangled. Horsey wasn't prone to fiction. He was a merchant and diplomat concerned with accuracy. When he wrote that Ivan was strangled, he was recording what he saw, heard, or believed, and he was positioned to know. He was in the Kremlin that day. Consider the scenario. Ivan sits at a chessboard. Belsky and Gordonov stand close enough to touch him. Both know they're marked for death. Both have access, both have motive. Within minutes of Ivan's death, Boris Gordonov took control. No chaos, no confusion. Almost as if it had been planned. The astrologers, by the way, were not burnt. They'd been right after all. March 18th. Exactly as predicted. Makes you wonder if they knew something beyond what the stars revealed. Ivan's body was quickly prepared for burial. No autopsy, no investigation. Within 3 days he was interred, taking his secrets with him. It would be nearly 400 years before anyone looked inside that tomb again. And what they found raised more questions than answers. Those mercury levels couldn't have accumulated accidentally. The arsenic suggested multiple poisoning agents. His teeth were in strangely perfect condition. So perfect some scientists wondered if they'd been replaced. Though 16th century dentistry makes this seem impossible. But bones don't reveal everything. They don't show the moment a chess piece fell. They don't capture a final breath cut short. They don't explain why an English witness would write that single damning word. Today, Ivan's name means tyrannical madness, but that almost understates what he truly was. He was a man who turned cruelty into governance, who made terror a system. His death, whether by stroke, poison or strangulation, was just the final scene in a life that had become a waking nightmare for everyone around him. But perhaps the most horrifying truth isn't how Ivan died. A famous painting captures it all in one image. Ivan cradling his dying son, eyes wide with the realization he's become the monster he always feared. That painting has been attacked and vandalized multiple times, most recently in 2018, as if people can't bear to look at what absolute power does to a human soul. Ivan wasn't born a monster.